Hi, everybody. My name is Tara Hunt, and the topic I've chosen for my persuasive presentation is battling gentrification with design. You don't have to look very deep into the news before you come across a headline lamenting the lack of affordable housing available in Canadian cities. In fact, according to The Conversation, Canada's housing market is among the most unaffordable, with one of the highest house price to income ratios among the OECD member states. This housing crisis disproportionately affects marginalized populations such as Indigenous and Black people, people with disabilities, and young lower income people. Though there are multiple drivers behind the rising housing costs, rising demand and population growth, ballooning construction costs, turning long-term housing into short-term rental units, interest rates, outdated government policies, etc., there's one phenomena that underpins many other factors. That is gentrification. In this presentation, I will demonstrate how gentrification makes housing unaffordable for the most vulnerable populations. I will also describe how architecture and interior design can contribute to the justice of marginalized populations by advocating for alternatives to gentrification, such as community-centric development models, sustainable design, and adaptive reuse projects. So let's start with the definition. What exactly is gentrification? Gentrification is a material and symbolic transformation of working-class neighborhoods into zones dominated by upper-middle-class residents and consumers. And the term was coined in 1964 by British sociologist Ruth Glass. And though this was over 60 years ago, there is no sign of the process of gentrification slowing down anytime soon. So then why does gentrification happen? Why is it that people with means all of a sudden decide to move into a poor neighborhood? What would drive a developer to even want to take a risk on building a luxury condo, for instance, in the middle of a neighborhood filled with people who can't afford to buy a unit? The answers can be explained through a couple of existing economic theories. Let's start with Neil Smith's rent gap theory. For Neil Smith, the answer to why gentrification was happening at such a large scale was simple. Land values had dropped due to white flight, making inner city properties cheap and attractive to buy. He said, gentrification occurs when the rent gap is wide enough that developers can purchase shells cheaply, can pay the builder's costs and profit for rehabilitation, can pay interest on mortgage and construction loans, and can sell the end product for a sale price that leaves a satisfactory return to the developer. Economics. Gentrification happens because there is an economic opportunity for it to happen. Disinvesting in lower income communities allows opportunists to swoop in and make money. Developers are in the business of developing properties that will make money, and if they can save money by paying rock bottom prices on a property itself, it makes these neighborhoods filled with abandoned buildings a great deal. However, while Smith's theory is sound when it comes to describing the impetus for a developer to buy and flip a building, he didn't supply as much of an answer for why someone would want to buy in a gentrified neighborhood. This is where David Lay's theories come into play. To be clear, David Lay did not call his theory the hipster theory, but he may as well have. I have called it that. Lay believed that only certain working class or low-income neighborhoods are ripe for gentrification. According to Lay, artists and creative types, aka hipsters, are quite often the harbingers of gentrification. This phenomena has been casually observed, as you can see in this cartoon here, but Lay's research validates it. Why are the artists picking these neighborhoods? Well, artists aim to live centrally, so seeking out central neighborhoods that are still affordable makes sense. On top of affordability, these areas need to be socially tolerant and culturally rich, attracting these denizens to minority communities. Being part of multicultural communities or different cultures can also be creatively enriching. It's not every disinvested neighborhood that attracts gentrification, nor is it necessarily the cheapest or most disinvested neighborhoods. In fact, there are plenty of cheap but not so cheerful neighborhoods well situated in major cities that developers won't touch with a 10-foot pole. As artists move in, they bring cultural capital, and this starts to attract others. That makes it interesting for the developers. Ultimately, however, it is the mix of cultural and economic capital that completes the negative effects of the gentrification process. Once the cultural capital has done its trick, attracting enough attention and interest into that neighborhood, the developers, well, they now know it's a safe bet to move in with their big condos. Now, is this inevitable? Is there a way that gentrification can be approached that both revitalizes a neighborhood and improves benefits for it rather than displaces people who've lived there before the influx of money? Is there a way to improve the neighborhood for everyone? Many have argued that there are positive effects of gentrification that bring notable improvements to derelict neighborhoods for existing residents. And of course, without capital improvements, the cycle described in Neil Smith's rent gap theory may continue towards an abandonment, driving all of the residents out either way. So let's entertain the positive side to gentrification then. So, one of the most cited positive outcomes to gentrification is reinvestment into neglected neighborhoods, improving the overall surroundings and amenities for residents. Yes, it's true, of course, but these improvements also, on the negative side, attract more affluent residents, which increases the demand for housing. Landlords will naturally take advantage of this demand and start to raise rents, which results in pushing the original residents out. I think this woman here in the photo says it all. Thanks for improving my neighborhood, but why does it mean I have to leave now? Back to the positive column again, gentrification means that property values go up, which is amazing for people who own property. But that doesn't usually include the low income people who live in the neighborhood. Most of them will be renters, and rather than benefiting from more valuable property values, they'll likely be evicted to make way for new owners. If someone does own, though, this may also be a problem. For instance, say an elderly person on a fixed income owns her own townhouse on a gentrified block, and maybe that townhouse is even paid off. Well, what happens when property values go up? Property taxes go up too. Many owners have lost their fully paid homes due to not being able to pay those inflated property taxes. Back to positive. Local businesses can get a boost from wealthier residents spending more at their shops and restaurants, right? Well, it turns out that more often local businesses are pushed out with those higher rents and non renewed leases to make way for chains and other businesses owned by the gentrifiers who want to move into the neighborhood to make money off those wealthier residents. More tax revenue, there you go, brings in further neighborhood amenities and improvements. But those improvements are usually weighted towards the gentrifiers who have more lobbying sway. The changing demographics in a gentrified neighborhood usually leads to tensions between new and old residents as cultural and social divisions become more pronounced. Decreased crime is often cited as well, but the reality is that that isn't true. A 2023 study showed that in many gentrified neighborhoods, gun violence was higher than before. And yes, reducing suburban sprawl is an excellent goal, but our inner cities are not usually designed for families with multiple vehicles and the additional visitor traffic brought to these neighborhoods. So it increases congestion. Ultimately, gentrification is great for the gentrifiers, especially the developers making bank on the rent gap, and not so great for those being gentrified. However, as Sally Harrison and Andrew Jacobs write in a 2017 paper advocating for architects and designers to approach development in a way that helps neighborhoods resist gentrification, that cities will change is indisputable. Urban evolution mostly signifies healthy growth. But it is also true that in a contemporary context, neighborhood change increasingly operates on an extraterritorial plane, happening quickly, opportunistically, and unilaterally. There is a role for architects and designers in working to maximize the benefits of revitalization and investing in previously disinvested neighborhoods while designing to avoid the negative effects of gentrification. As Teddy Cruz says, design can be a tool to fight the violence of displacement and the loss of identity in communities. Architects, designers, and urban planners have played significant roles in shaping spaces, neighborhoods, and cities, and have long recognized their roles in the design of both accelerating and mitigating the negative impacts of gentrification. Even before the term gentrification was coined, many architects in the early 20th century recognized the increasing unaffordability of secure housing and focused their efforts on designing neighborhoods and housing for low-income residents. Post-World War II, Le Corbusier designed Unité d'Habitation in 1952 in Marseille, France, as a housing project series of affordable communal living spaces for people displaced by the war. His concept was to create a vertical garden city, mixed-use building where the roughly 1,600 residents could live, shop, eat, exercise, and gather together. The units were uniquely designed with lots of airflow and light. It's very Le Corbusier, and colorful patios. The building had an incredible rooftop with gardens, a gym, a pool, and children's play areas, as well as wide corridors between the units, encouraging socializing, and is still iconic and inhabited today, although by middle-class professionals rather than low-income residents. And there are many more examples. Finnish mid-century architect Alvar Aalto was also occupied with the idea that design could help solve housing issues. Again, after the Second World War, Aalto built the Sanila Estates, affordable and functional houses for the workers of the Finnish pulp industry. The Brutalists focused on social housing, things such as Robin Hood Gardens in London. Walter Gropius of the Bauhaus designed multiple prototypes, including the Torton Housing Estate in Dessau. Frank Lloyd Wright had a vision for modern, inclusive community called Broad Acre City. In Canada, of course, we have Moshe Safdie's Habitat 67 that are going now for millions of dollars, unfortunately. But one of the biggest symbolic failures was the Pruitt-Igoe housing designed by Minoru Yamasaki in St. Louis, Missouri. Initially hailed as a modernist solution to post-war housing shortages, Pruitt-Igoe was constructed between 1954 and 1956 as a series of high-rise apartment buildings intended to house low-income residents. However, the buildings were poorly maintained, disinvested, plagued by crime, and disconnected from the surrounding community, and they were ultimately demolished in 1972. The 20th century modernist era of public housing and urban development failed to prevent or mitigate gentrification and sometimes even hasten the spread of it. So, what went awry? How could a group of such a smart, powerful, influential architects and starchitects get it so wrong? Well, the answer, I believe, lies in the more contemporary design approaches to solving this issue. While the previous generations of architects and designers looked to solve the issue of gentrification with large, multi-use complexes that were sometimes isolated from the surrounding city, today's architects and designers take a much more nuanced and inclusive approach. While design firms are still usually profit-driven, requiring large projects by developers and clients with deep pockets, their approach to these projects don't have to be passive. As Sally Harrison and Andrew Jacobs wrote, if designers expand their role beyond the consultant client product service delivery model, they can act both as partners in a shared civic endeavor and as agents capable of representing and advancing the oeuvre. Through research, I've identified several projects to design that increase community engagement and lower the potential negative effects of gentrification. Number one, focus on the importance of place. In an address to an audience of his fellow architects, Marlon Blackwell describes what he means by the importance of place. For us, place is the canvas and architecture is the medium, and place is shaped by the forces of nature and public life, in particular to local form. I like to say that we do work that is in the place, of the place, for the place, and sometimes necessarily out of place. But here, place is defined as a tangible representation of that intangible society that lives within it. I like to call this placeness. To make an architecture a placeness, it's necessary for us to embrace everything, even the bad things of a place, to get below the surface, to the underbelly, so that we can understand these things and incorporate them into who we are and what an architecture of the place, in the place, for the place can be. For the design of Mary Grove Early Education Center in Detroit, Michigan in 2021, he was told by the people in the local community that they didn't want just another monochromatic building on the Mary Grove campus, a campus that was covered with gray beige stone and brick buildings. Someone suggested that he consider the patchwork of quilts in his ideations. The idea inspired a multicolored terracotta cladding on the building, and it's pretty stunning. By focusing on the importance of place, Blackwell came up with a design that reflects the aesthetics of the local community. The second approach is to engage in co-creation and participatory design. From 2016 to 2019, Toronto-based architecture firm and design firm Lateral Office engaged in a fully immersive co-design process with the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation, the local Dene Elders Council, and the broader Indigenous community to design the future Arctic Indigenous Wellness Center in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. As Lola Shepard explains in an interview, architecture was used as a colonialist tool for a long time, something that was imposed on the people by governments. For decades, architects simply replicated imported Southern architectural modes and solutions in the North. But we see that architecture can be used as a tool for cultural empowerment by listening to people and giving form to their priorities and their understanding of places and programs. Co-design is about breaking down the hierarchy between the architect, client, and user. For and by a community is a great differentiator for a project and even a better way to ensure local buy-in for a project. Number three is to deploy a pepper potting strategy in urban planning. Pepper potting is a form of tenure-blind urban development where governments place a small and monitored percentage of affordable housing into a neighborhood that consists of predominantly open market dwellings. Since the aim is to integrate these affordable housing units or houses as effortlessly as possible into the middle-class neighborhoods, the focus lies on an architectural language that's indistinguishable from that of the surrounding buildings. There's sort of a reverse gentrification going on with pepper potting. Though these projects can be subject to NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, from existing residents, focusing on place and engaging in community co-creation can be key again. Quite often, architects will engage early in local communities and share early concepts for input and feedback. These projects are often smaller and they're designed to fit within the existing architecture. And mind you, this is architecture within an existing middle class community, not in the gentrified area. Various projects in the downtown east side of Vancouver mix residential, commercial, and community spaces with a significant portion dedicated to affordable housing, including the innovative Squatch Eyes Lodge, an Indigenous artist residential building and studios that primarily offer affordable housing to Indigenous artists, but also very high-end boutique hotel with Indigenous art theme rooms that rent for $375 a night on average, to offset the costs. Number 4 is to retrofit rather than new build. With an estimated shortfall of 3.1 million affordable homes in Canada by 2030, we need to get creative with the way we ramp up development. There are a lot of unused and underutilized buildings in Canada that are structurally sound but not currently fit for residential use, and these aren't necessarily in poor areas. Between the oodles of abandoned malls in the suburbs and other empty structures and the mostly empty office buildings alone, a wave of retrofitting projects could help close the gap and the shortfall. Architects and designers could really benefit from a trend of retrofitting and converting these projects because they require a lot of creative thinking for sure and require architects on them. Calgary has a huge amount of projects that are working on this sort of stuff. Number 5 is about breaking out of a generic box. Probably the most important thing an architect or a designer can do to fight gentrification is to use their design skills to make low-income housing or low projects special. One of the legacies left behind by previous low-income housing buildings is the aesthetic of austerity and institutionalism. Even with reduced budgets, community projects in low-income housing doesn't need to look low-cost and cheap. As Daniel Libeskind says, you can work within the budget and all the limitations and still produce something that has dignity. He's used it here at the Atrium at Sumner project in Brooklyn, New York, where he saved money by building on underutilized land, which is a huge savings since land in the area is at a premium. And by the way, this is low income or aging residents. In other projects, architects have saved money by using local labor and materials, involving local community volunteers in gardening projects, for instance, reusing, repurposing materials, and choosing to spend on what counts. And finally, number 6, designers need to think beyond the building and consider the long-term effects of that our projects will have on an area. A good example of unintentional negative impacts of a great project is the High Line Elevated Park in the Meatpacking District of Manhattan, New York. Formerly an abandoned raised railroad track that was a blight on the neighborhood and discouraged significant investment or redevelopment during that period, the design of the public park now attracts tens of millions of people each year. It's now seen as the poster child for gentrification and a cautionary tale for future green and or adaptive reuse inner city projects. Elizabeth Diller, whose firm Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro was one of the designers behind the High Line is on record as recognizing her role in the rapid gentrification of the area and reflects what should have been done instead. She says in a video, looking back on that period, there could have been legislation to make sure there was more equity in the way these properties developed, making sure that inclusionary zoning is part of the overall mix, that you can get different income levels as part of a city fabric so that you don't evict artists all of a sudden because they can't pay the rent. This is all a sad outcome of a project that aimed to slow gentrification through the building of a public resource. Today, Robert Hammond and Joshua David, the founders of Friend of the High Line, work with similar projects all over North America to advocate for legislation and zoning to protect those low-income neighborhoods surrounding the projects. This lesson underscores the importance of designers to act as partners, take more active roles in planning in general, and we need to think about the consequences of potential success, which is our goal, right? So this type of active partnership can influence and steer projects in a more inclusive and generous direction, can be sold to the client in many ways. A project that works with the local community in actively ensuring local residents benefit from the project and works to reduce negative effects of gentrification can help the client by, number one, getting community support and buy-in. This can help avoid opposition, protests, or delays during the approval processes, lowering development costs and maximizing potential profits. Costs associated with those delays due to red tape, lobbying, vandalism, and bad press could really add up. And ultimately, stabilizing the project can only improve the profitability, creating long-term sustainability of the current and future projects. So good relationships built around the project can create opportunities for future lucrative projects in and around the area. By committing to these goals, a client may access tax incentives, grants, or favorable financing that can improve the financial viability of the project, such as in Vancouver, growing a positive reputation for their own brand, inviting praise in the press and beyond. That's free publicity, improving their brand and attracting investors or tenants who may value corporate responsibility, and increasing market demand and appeal. A development that creates economic opportunities for local residents can also attract those really high-paying, socially conscious renters or buyers. So appealing to the developer's own goals is an easier sell than it's just the right thing to do. And there's a lot of ways to appeal to them. So beyond our ability to influence our clients and projects, we can also work to support grassroots efforts already in progress. As I did the research, I kept coming across the question as to the alternatives for development. Are there only commercial development versus neighborhood deterioration, blockbusting, and abandonment? Nope. That's a false dichotomy. As Loretta Lee says, gentrification is sold to us as a false choice. Urbanism, a choice between growth or decline and decay, and this mantra that there's no alternative has become hegemonic. There are all sorts of community-led alternatives in progress, many in our backyard. Community gardening, community painting and mural projects, community cleanup projects, even community building projects. In many places, locals have even come together to raise funds to buy up land and buildings in their neighborhoods, to renovate and retrofit, keeping the external developers out. One of these funds is the Kensington Market Land Trust in Toronto, which has successfully been buying up key buildings and plots of lands in the neighborhood. There are other forms of community organized ownership collectives such as cooperatives, community housing associations, community civic associations, and local business revitalization associations, which have big say on who and who cannot move into a neighborhood, keeping it authentic. In Philadelphia, similar organizations kept the Centro de Oro, a Hispanic neighborhood, safe from predatory developers while also investing in the local culture and communities so that the neighborhoods can advance and thrive. There is also in Canada the Architects Against Housing Alienation, collective of architects, designers, and housing advocates committed to addressing the housing crisis through innovative and equitable design solutions. The group, spearheaded by prominent figures such as David Fortin, Matthew Souls, and Adrian Blackwell, emphasizes the role of architecture in creating inclusive, community-oriented housing that prioritizes the needs of marginalized and underrepresented populations. AAHA actively collaborates with community organizations, policymakers, and academics to inspire systemic change and foster meaningful dialogue about equitable housing futures. So you can get involved in that, designers. I know I am. Listen, gentrification is not inevitable. It is not the natural cost of progress. It is the result of a series of decisions that are meant to maximize the outcomes for one particular group, often at the expense of everyone else. We can use design and approaches to revitalization that consider the needs of everyone, and we can make decisions that benefit all. As Tom Ngotti says, change occurs all the time and in every neighborhood. People move in and out. Buildings fall into disrepair and undergo renovation, and businesses come and go. Gentrification is not improvement of housing, public space, and the physical improvement of the environment. That can and does happen without gentrification. Development doesn't need to mean displacement. By focusing on community involvement, adaptive reuse, advocacy, and designs prioritizing cultural heritage and affordability, we can create neighborhoods where long-term residents aren't pushed out, but instead thrive alongside new developments. We can use our creativity and influence to build cities that are sustainable, inclusive, and equitable, places where everyone has a stake in shaping the future and is empowered to do so. To truly contribute to the justice of marginalized populations, we need to shift our mindset from purely profit-driven growth to people-driven design, where urban spaces can become vibrant, diverse hubs, and progress truly benefits all. Thank you.